Setting the perfect reverb level in your mix can be tricky. It might seem like it's always too washed out or too dry, and it can be really hard to find the right balance. Pros deal with this all the time as well, but they've got a lot of tricks to help them get the reverb level just right. And that's exactly what I'm going to simplify and break down for you in this video. We'll be covering 6 really valuable techniques that the pros use all the time, and we're going to cover a ton of ground. I'll give you some practical step-by-step guides on how you can apply this in your sessions. So let's get started. The first tip is actually just great general mixing advice, but especially when it comes to setting the reverb levels correctly, and that is mix quiet, check loud. What this means is 80 to 90% of the time when you're mixing, you should be doing it at a relatively quiet level. A rule of thumb I like to use is I should always be able to have a conversation over the mix that I'm working on without having to raise my voice. If I can do that, I know I'm working at a low enough level. Of course, we want to make sure we can hear everything, so make sure you're working loud enough to where you can hear the details in the mix, but soft enough to where you can have that conversation over top the mix. Now, after you get your mix to sound great at that quieter level, the important thing is to check it loud. This is where you're going to reveal if you're overusing reverb. If you turn up your monitor level and it sounds like your mix is just drowning in reverb, chances are you're using too much. Try dialing it back, set it at a good level loud, and then go back to mixing soft and see if it still feels right. This is a really good way to catch overusing reverb. So that's the first tip, mix quiet and check loud. The next tip is similar. It has to do with how you're listening. For reverb, it's always best to try to set it over monitors or speakers, not over headphones. Almost every time you set reverb over headphones, you're going to use more than you probably want. This is because when you're listening to speakers in a room, you're naturally getting a little bit of ambience from the room, even in a treated dead room. And this really influences your choices as you're applying reverb in your mix. If you're listening over headphones, you're probably going to compensate for that lack of natural physical space, and you're going to overuse reverb. And the result of that is, as soon as you check it in your car or over speakers, you're going to notice like, wow, there's too much reverb in this mix. Now, if headphones are all you have to work with, don't worry, you can absolutely make it work. In fact, there have been some massive records that have been mixed reportedly only on headphones. So the important thing is just to know that you might have a tendency to overuse reverb on headphones. So probably just use a bit less than you might think you need, and you'll probably be okay. It's also great to just check on other systems, like maybe in a car or on some type of consumer speaker. This is going to help you get that reverb level right. So if at all possible, always try to set your reverb level over speakers, not over headphones. The next tip is something I like to do when I want a massive reverb sound, but I don't want to sacrifice the clarity and articulation of the sound that I'm putting it on. Listen to this mix before I apply any reverb. Now I want to give this vocal in the build-up a really massive atmospheric reverb. So I'm going to load Supernova on it and take a listen to what it sounds like if I just give this a ton of reverb. So I really like how that sounds, but naturally we're going to lose a little bit of clarity and presence from the vocal whenever we apply a bunch of reverb and delay like this. And that's where ducking comes in handy. On Supernova, I can apply ducking just like this. And this is going to move the wet signal out of the way whenever the dry signal is coming through. Take a listen to how much clarity we get back to this vocal, even though we're still using this big, massive space. So we can see the ducking working with these meters. And what I love about this in Supernova is that we can set the shape of the ducker like this. So if you want it to be super tight and precise, you can set it like this. This is great for things like transient material, drums, percussion, anytime where you want it to be a really tight ducking, or we can set a much smoother, more transparent ducking shape. And this is going to help with things like vocals, where you want it to duck, but you don't necessarily want to hear it ducking. You want it to be very natural and transparent.
'Cause you don't need to run away tonight.
So you can hear how that just very smoothly ducks it out of the way and brings it back. It brings all the clarity we need to the vocal, but it also doesn't sound like we're ducking it. So try this out when you want big spaces in your mix without sacrificing the clarity. The next tip is another way to bring back clarity to a reverb, and that is to use the depth. Now this relates specifically to a feature in Supernova called the depth knob. And this works quite a bit differently than other size or depth knobs you might find on other reverb plugins. So basically we're controlling the position of the source and the listener within the space around them. So a high depth is going to make it sound like that source is very far away from you in the space. And as you bring that depth down, it's going to still be within the space, but it's just going to sound like that source is getting much closer to you. So I'm going to isolate this depth knob. Just take a listen to what it sounds like as we bring this vocal forward. It's going to sound like the vocal is just getting closer to us, even though we're still in the same massive space. So we can use that to bring back a ton of clarity to the vocal. So try playing around with the depth knob in Supernova if you need a little bit more clarity on a vocal. You just want to bring it forward in the mix more, but you still want it to feel like it's in that giant space. So the next trick isn't actually specifically about reverb, but about delay. See, delay can be used in a very similar way to create these bigger, larger than life sounding spaces in a mix. But the benefit is that we have a much less dense sound when we use delay. And that allows us to use a little bit more of it. We can pair it with a reverb and get an even bigger sounding space without it getting muddy. Listen to how much extra space we get with the delay in Supernova when we apply it to this already big reverb.
'Cause you don't need to run away tonight. 'Cause you don't need to run away tonight.
So sometimes when you want that big lush reverb sound, you want to use a big reverb, but you can also pair it with the right delay in order to add that sense of width and space and movement without having to go completely crazy with a crazy long reverb time. One of the things to play around with is the blend between reverb and delay. And whenever you're in parallel mode in Supernova, it's really easy. You can just use this slider to choose either heavier on the delay or heavier on the reverb.
'Cause you don't need to run away tonight. 'Cause you don't need to run away tonight.
So it's really easy to find the perfect sweet spot between reverb and delay when you blend them together in this way. We've got one more pro tip to cover in this video, and that is to use the bypass test on your reverb. Reverb is one of those things where your ear gets used to it after a little bit. You don't really hear it as obviously after you've been listening for a while. And we have to remind our ears occasionally what it sounds like without reverb in order to hear how much we're applying. And the best way to do that is just with a quick bypass test. Simply bypassing the reverb and delay on a track in your mix, sending it back to that dry signal is going to really give us a sense of how much that reverb and delay is adding.
'Cause you don't need to run away tonight. 'Cause you don't need to run away tonight.
So for example, at 40% on the dry wet knob, it didn't necessarily sound like there was too much reverb. But as soon as we bypassed it and we heard what it sounded like dry, it was obvious that we could cut this back a bit and still get the effect we were looking for. So cutting it back into the 20% range or so gave us that sense of clarity a little bit more, and we still had a ton of reverb. When we bypassed it, even at 20%, it was still a massive difference in the mix. And so we know that what we're applying, even at this lower amount, was still being heard and felt in the mix. So this is a great way to use this. Whenever you're setting that reverb level, if you want it to be a bit more natural, you don't want to overuse your reverb, try turning the amount down while you're doing the bypass test. A lot of times you can use a lot less reverb than you might think, to where it still makes a big difference when it goes away, so you're definitely hearing it and feeling it still, but it's not quite as obvious sticking out in the mix. Most of the time, that's actually the right amount of reverb to use. This is also a great way to check to make sure you're using enough reverb. If you don't hear any difference at all when you bypass and unbypass, chances are you're not using enough reverb if that's the effect you want. I hope you found this video helpful. If you enjoyed it, leave us a comment, give it a like, and subscribe for more tutorials like this. And as always, happy mixing.